Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd like to remind you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps me continue bringing you bedtime stories filled with atmosphere and detail, perfect for when the night grows quiet and the mind drifts toward other places. Now, let's begin. Thanksgiving at Grandma Helen's house in Ohio. It was late November in the year 2016. The air outside carried a familiar bite of approaching winter, the kind that turned one's breath into a fleeting mist beneath the pale gray sky. Leaves had long since abandoned the maple trees in Lancaster, a small town tucked away in central Ohio, leaving only bare branches that scratched faintly against the windows when the wind picked up. Grandma Helen's house stood proudly on the corner of Walnut Street, a two-story home built back in the late 1940s. Its wooden siding, once bright white, had faded to a gentle cream, and the porch creaked whenever someone stepped onto it. But inside, the house seemed to carry warmth in every corner. The kitchen smelled of roasted turkey and sage stuffing, a mixture so rich it seemed to embrace you the moment you walked through the door. The family had gathered early that morning. Sarah, the eldest granddaughter, had driven all the way from Cleveland with her two children, Matthew and Ella, who rushed inside carrying paper bags of homemade cranberry sauce. Her brother, Daniel, had flown in from London only the night before, his accent a little more polished than the last time they had heard it. He wore a navy coat that looked slightly too thin for the Ohio cold, and Grandma Helen teased him about forgetting how harsh Midwestern Novembers could be. The living room was filled with voices, laughter, and the gentle crackle of the old fireplace. A football game played faintly on the television in the background, though hardly anyone was paying attention. Cousins exchanged stories from school. Uncles argued lightly about which pie would turn out best. And in the dining room, the long oak table was already set with lace runner, crystal glasses, and Helen's collection of porcelain plates, reserved only for holidays like this. There was something about the house that evening, something layered in both memory and presence. The photographs along the hallway showed past Thanksgivings, with faces that had grown older, children that had grown taller, and some loved ones who were no longer there. It made the gathering feel both joyous and bittersweet, a moment held between the weight of the past and the unfolding of the present. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting an amber glow across the frosted grass. Inside, Grandma Helen's voice rose above the chatter as she called everyone to the table. The family moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as though each wanted to stretch out those moments of anticipation before the meal began. Chairs scraped softly against the wooden floor. Glasses clinked, and the fragrance of freshly baked pumpkin pie drifted in from the kitchen. Daniel, still shaking off his jet lag, sat at the far end of the table, directly across from Sarah. He glanced around, taking in the familiar faces, the details of the room that had barely changed since his childhood. The floral wallpaper, the grandfather clock that ticked steadily in the corner, the candle holders that always stood in the same place year after year. For a moment, it was as if time had folded, returning him to a younger version of himself, before careers, travel, and distance had created the spaces between them. But just as the first plates were being filled, the sound of front door opening startled everyone. It wasn't unusual for family to arrive late, but the timing felt strange. The room quieted, heads turning toward the hallway. Heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, and soon a figure emerged, someone no one had expected to see that evening. The figure who stepped into the living room paused for a moment, brushing the cold air from their coat. It was Uncle Robert. His presence alone stirred a wave of surprise, because Robert hadn't joined a family Thanksgiving in nearly 12 years. He was Helen's eldest son, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying with him the faint scent of cigarette smoke mixed with the crisp outside air. His hair, once thick and dark, was now streaked with silver, and the deep lines of his face revealed years spent away from family gatherings. For a second, silence filled the room. The chatter, the clinking of silverware, even the soft hum of the football commentary seemed to vanish. All eyes turned toward him. Grandma Helen, standing at the head of the table, clutched the back of her chair with both hands. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out immediately. "Robert," she finally whispered, her voice trembling between shock and relief. He smiled faintly, though it was the kind of smile that carried weight behind it. "Happy Thanksgiving, Ma," he said, his voice deep, a little hoarse from years of smoking. The younger cousins, some of whom barely remembered him, stared with curiosity. Sarah glanced toward Daniel, and for once his polished London composure seemed to falter. They hadn't expected this. No one had. Robert removed his coat and hung it on the rack by the door. The room seemed to shift around him, the air thick with questions left unspoken. Slowly, Grandma Helen stepped forward, her step steady but heavy, until she reached her son. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, as though afraid he might vanish again as she let go. The embrace broke the tension. Conversation slowly resumed, though more cautious now. Voices lowered as though everyone was adjusting to the sudden change. Robert was offered a seat at the table, right next to Daniel, who gave a polite nod before glancing away, unsure what to say. Dinner began. Plates were passed around, turkey carved carefully, stuffing scooped generously, and glasses filled with sparkling cider. But beneath the laughter and familiar holiday cheer, there was an undercurrent, a ripple of unease, of curiosity, of stories yet to be told. Daniel found himself watching Robert more closely than he intended. Between bites of food and polite conversation, Robert's eyes wandered around the room, pausing at the photographs on the wall, the worn carpet, the clock that had ticked for decades. It was as if he was trying to reconcile the home he had left with the one standing before him now. At one point, little Ella, Sarah's daughter, leaned toward him and asked in her soft 7-year-old voice, "Are you really Grandma's son?" The table chuckled at her bluntness, but Robert only smiled and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm her son. That makes me your great-uncle." She tilted her head, studying him as though trying to place his face into the family puzzle. Then, satisfied, she returned to her plate of mashed potatoes. The moment seemed simple, but it carried weight. It was a reminder that generations were overlapping, that some connections had been lost, and others were just being formed for the first time. As dinner continued, the house filled with the warmth of food and family. Yet outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows and pressing against the walls. It was the kind of wind that carried with it a hint of snow, sharp and cold, a promise of the winter to come. After the meal, when the plates were cleared and desserts placed on the table, pumpkin pie, pecan pie, and apple crumble, conversations grew livelier. Stories of past Thanksgiving surfaced, laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire. But Robert remained somewhat apart, answering questions when asked, smiling when prompted, yet never fully immersing himself in the chorus of voices. Eventually, Daniel excused himself from the table and stepped into the hallway. He needed a moment to breathe, to gather his thoughts. It had been years since he had last seen Robert, and even then, the meeting had been brief, strained. There were things unsaid, gaps in the family narrative that had never been filled. He leaned against the wooden banister of the staircase, staring at the photographs along the wall. One in particular caught his eye, a faded picture of a Thanksgiving from the early 1990s. Robert was there, younger, smiling, with an arm around Helen, and another holding a plate of food. Daniel remembered that year, vaguely, the smell of pie and the sound of laughter. But soon after, Robert had disappeared from these gatherings, and whispers had replaced his presence. Footsteps approached. Robert himself had followed him into the hallway, holding a glass of cider in his hand. For a moment, neither spoke. They stood side by side, gazing at the same photograph. "Feels like another lifetime, doesn't it?" Robert finally said, His voice low, Daniel nodded slowly. It does. You've missed a lot. I know. Robert sighed, rubbing his forehead with his free hand. And I can't change that. But maybe I can start again. Daniel turned to look at him, searching for sincerity in his words. The house behind them buzzed with the muffled sounds of family. But here in the hallway, it was quieter, more fragile. Before Daniel could respond, a sudden knock came at the front door. It was sharp, unexpected, and immediately drew the attention of the others in the dining room. Conversations halted. Chairs scraped against the floor. Grandma Helen, still seated at the table, raised her head slowly. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Concern, perhaps, or recognition. Who could that be? Sarah muttered, rising from her seat. Robert placed his glass on the small wooden table by the stairs and moved toward the door. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, as though he already suspected something. Daniel followed closely, curiosity pulling him forward. When Robert opened the door, the cold wind rushed inside, carrying with a swirl of brittle leaves. And there, standing on the porch beneath the dim glow of the street lamp, was a man no one had seen in even longer than Robert. His presence sent a ripple through the house, a shock that silenced even the youngest children. It was Uncle Thomas, the brother who had left not just a family, but Ohio itself decades ago. His arrival, like Robert's, was completely unannounced. And yet, here he was, his figure silhouetted against the November night, holding a weathered suitcase in one hand. The silence was deep, almost unbearable, until Thomas spoke. Mind if I come in? And just like that, the night, which had already been filled with unexpected turns, took on a new weight, one that carried with it the echoes of old conflicts, forgotten promises, and stories waiting to resurface after years of silence. Thomas stood at the doorway, his shoulders hunched against the chill of the November wind. The suitcase in his hand looked worn, its leather edges frayed, as though it had traveled countless miles. His coat was dark and heavy, and his face bore the lines of someone who had spent a lifetime away, carrying burdens unseen by the rest of the family. For several long seconds, no one moved. The family remained frozen in their seats, their eyes flicking between Robert, who had only just returned, and Thomas, whose appearance seemed even more unlikely. It was as if the walls of Grandma Helen's old house had suddenly become a stage, and everyone inside was holding their breath, waiting for the first word that would break the silence. Finally, Helen herself rose from the dining table. She walked slowly toward the door, her slippers soft against the creaking wooden floor. Her hands trembled slightly, though whether from age or emotion was unclear. When she reached the threshold, she looked up at her second eldest son, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice carrying both relief and disbelief. "After all these years." Thomas gave a tired smile, setting his suitcase gently down on the porch before stepping inside. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold wind, and in that moment, the warmth of the house seemed to shift, as though absorbing the weight of his presence. "Hello, Ma," he said simply. His voice was softer than Robert's, but there was a roughness in it too, as if time and distance had worn it thin. Robert cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Didn't think I'd ever see you here again." Thomas turned his gaze toward him, his eyes narrowing for just a second before softening. "And I didn't expect to find you here either." The exchange was brief, but it carried years of unspoken history. The rest of the family glanced nervously between them, unsure what to say or do. Sarah gestured toward the table, her voice cautious but welcoming. "Well, the food's still warm," she said. "Why don't you join us? We got plenty." It was enough to move things forward. Thomas nodded, removed his coat, and followed his mother into the dining room. Chairs were shuffled, places made. The long oak table, already crowded, seemed to stretch itself thinner to accommodate the sudden return of another absent figure. As they sat again, the atmosphere was different. The warmth of the meal lingered, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg drifting from the pies, but beneath it lay an unmistakable tension. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than usual, each second marking the uneasy silence between bites of food and stolen glances. Daniel found himself studying both uncles. Robert, with his broad frame and restless hands, seemed uneasy, his eyes darting around as though looking for escape. Thomas, by contrast, carried a quiet stillness, though his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. They were men shaped by distance, by choices that led them away from family, and then somehow back again on the very same night. Grandma Helen, however, looked radiant in a way Daniel had not seen in years. Despite the tension, she seemed content just to have her sons under her roof again, as if the years of separation and silence had been washed away in a single evening. She poured cider into Thomas's glass with steady hands, her smile soft and forgiving. As dessert plates were passed around, little Matthew, Sarah's son, broke the heaviness with a question only a child could ask. "Grandma, why haven't Uncle Robert and Uncle Thomas been here before?" The table froze again. Sarah quickly hushed him, embarrassment flooding her cheeks. But Helen only chuckled, patting the boy's hand. "They've been busy with life, dear. Sometimes life takes us far away. But tonight," she added, glancing warmly at her sons, "tonight they are here, and that is what matters." The conversation picked up again after that, though more careful, as if everyone was stepping around fragile glass. Stories were exchanged, safe ones, about the food, about travels, about how much the children had grown. Yet Daniel could feel the weight of untold stories hanging over the table like a shadow. Later, after the pies were finished and the younger children had dozed off on the couch with blankets tucked around them, the adults lingered in the living room. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The television was muted now, the football game long forgotten. It was then that Robert finally spoke. "I didn't come here just for the turkey," he said, his tone rough, his eyes fixed on the fire. The room quieted. Everyone turned to him, waiting. "I came because I needed to," he continued. "I've made mistakes, more than I can count, and I thought maybe it wasn't too late to fix some of them." Helen's hand tightened around the armrest of her chair. Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing, letting him speak. Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. Robert sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't expect Thomas to show up. Not tonight. But maybe that's the way it was meant to be." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Finally, Thomas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We both left," he said quietly. "We both stayed away. And we both hurt this family in ways we can't undo." He looked at Robert directly, his voice steady. "But maybe we can at least stop running." It was a rare moment of honesty, stripped of defenses. For the first time that evening, the brothers seemed less like strangers and more like fragments of the same family, finally returning to the place they had once called home. Daniel sat back, absorbing every word. He realized then that this Thanksgiving was not just about food or tradition. It was about something deeper, about return, about reconciliation, about the fragile threads that held a family together even when stretched thin by years of silence. The hours passed. Stories grew longer, voices softer. One by one, the younger members of the family drifted off to bed, leaving only a handful of adults awake in the dim light. Outside, snow began to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the windows, settling on the quiet streets of Walnut Street. Inside, the fire burned low, the air warm and heavy with the scent of wood smoke and pie. And though the night carried tension, It also carried a sense of possibility, as if old wounds might slowly begin to heal beneath the roof of Grandma Helen's house. But just as peace seemed to settle over the gathering, a sound came from upstairs, a creak on the floorboards, light but unmistakable, as though someone was walking where no one should be. The family exchanged glances. All the children were asleep downstairs, tucked safely under blankets. The guest rooms upstairs had not been used in years. Robert rose to his feet first, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Daniel nodded, his pulse quickening. Another creak followed, this one closer to the staircase. The air in the room shifted, the warmth of the fire suddenly unable to mask the chill that crept into the silence. Grandma Helen's face grew pale, her eyes fixed on the stairs, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she knew something the others did not. No one spoke. The only sound was a slow, deliberate groan of the old wooden steps, as if someone or something was making its way down toward them. And in that moment, the night that had already been filled with surprises was about to reveal yet another layer, one that none of them had been prepared for. Helen's hand tightened around the armrest of her chair. Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing, letting him speak. Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. Robert sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't expect Thomas to show up. Not tonight. But maybe that's the way it was meant to be." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Finally, Thomas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We both left," he said quietly. "We both stayed away. And we both hurt this family in ways we can't undo." He looked at Robert directly, his voice steady. "But maybe we can at least stop running." It was a rare moment of honesty, stripped of defenses. For the first time that evening, the brothers seemed less like strangers and more like fragments of the same family, finally returning to the place they had once called home. Daniel sat back, absorbing every word. He realized then that this Thanksgiving was not just about food or tradition. It was about something deeper, about return, about reconciliation, about the fragile threads that held a family together even when stretched thin by years of silence. The hours passed. Stories grew longer, voices softer. One by one, the younger members of the family drifted off to bed, leaving only a handful of adults awake in the dim light. Outside, snow began to fall, delicate flakes drifting past windows, settling on the quiet streets of Walnut Street. Inside, the fire burned low, the air warm and heavy with the scent of wood smoke and pie. And though the night carried tension, it also carried a sense of possibility, as if old wounds might slowly begin to heal beneath the roof of Grandma Helen's house. But just as peace seemed to settle over the gathering, a sound came from upstairs, a creak on the floorboards, light but unmistakable, as though someone was walking where no one should be. The family exchanged glances. All the children were asleep downstairs, tucked safely under blankets. The guest rooms upstairs had not been used in years. Robert rose to his feet first, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Daniel nodded, his pulse quickening. Another creak followed, this one closer to the staircase. The air in the room shifted, the warmth of the fire suddenly unable to mask the chill that crept into the silence. Grandma Helen's face grew pale, her eyes fixed on the stairs, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she knew something the others did not. No one spoke. The only sound was a slow, deliberate groan of the old wooden steps, as if someone or something was making its way down toward them. And in that moment, the night that had already been filled with surprises was about to reveal yet another layer, one that none of them had been prepared for. The room was wrapped in silence as every pair of eyes drifted toward the staircase. The old wooden banister cast long shadows against the wall, and the faint glow from the fireplace flickered across the bottom steps. For a moment, no one moved, and even the fire itself seemed quiet as if listening. Then came another creak, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of the house settling. It was footsteps, slow, measured, moving down from the upper floor where no one had gone all evening. Robert clenched his jaw and took a step forward, his heavy frame cutting through the tension. "I'll check," he muttered, though his tone betrayed unease. Daniel followed him instinctively, though his heart pounded. He could not explain why, but something in the air felt wrong, as though the warmth of the night had been swallowed by an invisible cold. The rest of the family remained behind in the living room. Sarah drew her children closer, wrapping a blanket around them even though they were half asleep. Grandma Helen stayed in her chair, her face pale and unreadable. Her eyes were fixed on the staircase, but she said nothing, as if words might invite whatever presence lingered above to descend more quickly. Robert reached the foot of the stairs. His hand gripped the banister, knuckles white, and he tilted his head upward. The second floor was cloaked in shadow, the light from below unable to reach the top landing. He swallowed hard, then called out, his voice steady but low. "Who's there?" Silence answered. Then, from the shadows above, came the faintest sound, like the drag of fabric against wood, or perhaps a whispered breath carried on the still air. Daniel shivered. "Robert," he whispered, "maybe we should wake the kids and—" But Robert shook his head, cutting him off. "No. If someone's up there, we deal with it now." He began climbing, each step groaning under his weight. Daniel hesitated, but then followed, his own footsteps lighter, though no less tense. The house seemed to listen with them, every creak amplified, every breath shallow. When they reached the landing, the air felt colder. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors to rooms long unused. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in some corners, and the dim light from a single bulb overhead flickered faintly. Robert pointed toward the far door. That was the guest room. Sound came from there. Daniel nodded, though his throat was dry. Together, they moved forward, the floorboards complaining beneath their weight. Robert reached the door first and pushed it open slowly. The hinges groaned, echoing through the hall. Inside, the room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. The faint outline of furniture appeared in the shadows. The old dresser, the iron bed frame, the quilt folded at the foot of it. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by their entry. But the room was empty. Robert stepped inside, his eyes scanning every corner. "No one here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Daniel lingered by the door, his pulse still racing. Then what did we hear? Before Robert could answer, a sudden thud echoed from the room across the hall. Both men froze, their eyes locking for a split second before they darted back into the hallway. The sound had come from Helen's old sewing room, a space no one had entered in years. Robert exhaled sharply. "All right, let's finish this." He crossed the hallway, Daniel close behind, and reached for the doorknob. It was cold against his palm, colder than it should have been. He twisted it slowly, then pushed the door open. The sewing room smelled faintly of mothballs and old fabric. The sewing machine sat in the corner, draped in a dusty sheet. Boxes of fabric scraps and patterns were stacked neatly against the wall. The air was heavy, untouched by life for years. And yet, the rocking chair by the window moved gently, creaking back and forth as though someone had only just risen from it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Robert." But Robert said nothing. He stepped inside, his eyes locked on the chair. It rocked slower now, then still completely. The two men stood there, listening, waiting. The silence pressed against their ears, heavy and suffocating. Then a whisper, barely audible, yet clear enough to chill them both. "Why did you leave?" Daniel spun around, searching the room. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried on the air like a memory. Robert's face drained the color, his fists clenched, but his body remained rigid, rooted to the floor. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice louder now, breaking the silence. No reply, only the sound of the wind outside, rattling the window panes. They searched the room, behind boxes, beneath the quilt, even the closet where old coats still hung. But nothing, no sign of anyone living. Finally, Robert turned back toward the hall. "We're done here. Whatever it is, it's not staying." But Daniel, still staring at the rocking chair, wasn't so sure. He felt the air shift again, colder, heavier, as though unseen eyes were watching them leave. They returned downstairs, their faces pale. The family looked up as they entered, the unspoken question hanging in the room. "Well," Sarah asked, her voice tense. Robert shook his head. "Nothing, just the house settling." But Grandma Helen's gaze lingered on him, sharp and knowing. She didn't look convinced. As the night wore on, the family tried to return to normalcy. The children were tucked into makeshift beds on the sofas, blankets piled high. The adults sipped tea or coffee, speaking in hushed tones. But the tension never fully left. Every creak of the old house made them glance toward the stairs. Every gust of wind against the windows seemed heavier than it should have been. Near midnight, when most had drifted into uneasy sleep, Daniel sat awake by the fire. He couldn't shake the sound of that whisper, the way it had carried more sorrow than anger. He glanced toward the hallway, where the photographs lined the wall, generations of the family frozen in moments of happiness. And he noticed, for the first time, a missing photograph. A small square of faded wallpaper, where a frame had clearly once hung. He turned to Helen, who was still awake in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Grandma," he said softly, careful not to wake the others. "What was here?" He gestured toward the empty space. Her eyes followed his hand, and for a long time she said nothing. Finally, her voice came, low and heavy. "That was a picture of your grandfather," she whispered, "taken on the last Thanksgiving before he passed." Daniel frowned. "Why isn't it there anymore?" Helen's gaze shifted toward the staircase, her face unreadable. "Because some things are too heavy to keep staring at." The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Daniel leaned back, unease curling in his chest. And from upstairs, faint but undeniable, came the sound of the rocking chair creaking once more. The creaking sound from upstairs seemed to echo longer than it should have, a drawn-out complaint of old that lingered in the ears even after silence returned. Daniel's skin prickled, every hair along his arms lifting with a sense of unease he could not shake. He stared at his grandmother, who still gazed toward the staircase, her lips pressed tightly together as though holding back words. "Grandma," he whispered again, his voice low so as not to wake the others. "That wasn't just a house, was it?" Helen did not answer right away. She shifted in her chair, the firelight catching the fine lines of her face, deepening the shadows beneath her eyes. Finally, she let out a long, tired breath. "This house remembers," she said softly, almost to herself. "It always has." Daniel frowned, leaning closer. "Remembers what?" Her gaze fell back to the empty place on the wall, where the photograph of his grandfather had once hung. For a moment she looked far away, lost in memories too heavy to share. Before she could answer, Robert stirred on the sofa, his eyes flickering open. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. "Still talking?" he muttered, his voice rough with sleep. Helen glanced at him, her expression sharpening. "Go back to rest, Robert. You need it." But Robert shook his head, standing. "No, I heard it too." He turned toward the stairs, his jaw tightening. And I'm not about to sit here pretending it's nothing. Daniel rose with him, unsure whether to feel relieved or unsettled that his uncle seemed just as disturbed. Together they moved toward the staircase again. The rest of the family remained asleep. Sarah curled with her children under blankets, Thomas leaning back in an armchair with his eyes closed though his body tense, as though he wasn't truly asleep at all. The two men climbed the stairs once more. This time, the air felt even colder, carried with a faint scent, something like tobacco smoke mixed with old wood polish. It was strangely familiar, though Daniel couldn't place it. They paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Silence pressed against their ears, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock below. Then, a soft scrape from the sewing room. The sound of the rocking chair shifting again. Robert exhaled heavily. "Enough of this," he muttered. He strode forward and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room looked exactly as it had before, dusty, abandoned, the chair still by the window. But this time, the curtains were parted just slightly, though neither of them remembered opening them earlier. Moonlight spilled in, silver and cold, cutting across the floorboards and casting long shadows against the walls. The rocking chair was still. Daniel stepped closer, his heart pounding. He reached out and touched the back of the chair. The wood was icy cold, as though it had been left outside in the snow. Robert stood by the window. His eyes narrowed. He looked out into the night, the street below quiet, snowflakes drifting lazily to the pale glow of the street lamp. Then he froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Daniel joined him at the window, peering out. At first, he saw nothing but the empty street and the blanket of snow beginning to cover the lawns. Then, at the far end of Walnut Street, near the old oak tree, he saw a figure. It stood motionless, barely more than a shadow against the whiteness. Too far away to make out features, but tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in what looked like a long coat. The figure did not move. It simply stood, facing the house. Robert swore under his breath. "This isn't funny," he muttered. Daniel blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. The space beneath the oak tree was empty, the snow undisturbed. They stared for a long moment, neither speaking. Finally, Robert pulled the curtains shut with a sharp tug. "We're not telling the others. Not tonight." Daniel wanted to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He knew the children wouldn't sleep if they heard. Still, keeping silent felt wrong too, as though silence itself might feed whatever was happening in the house. They left the sewing room and returned downstairs. By then, the fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. Helen had dozed off in her chair, her chin resting against her chest, but her face looked troubled even in sleep. Thomas's eyes opened as they entered, and he studied them both quietly. "You saw something," he said softly, more statement than a question. Robert's jaw clenched. He poured himself a drink of cider, though his hand shook slightly as he lifted the glass. "Just shadows," he muttered. "That's all." Thomas didn't press, but his gaze lingered. Daniel could tell he didn't believe a word of it. The night dragged on slowly. The snow outside thickened, muffling the world beyond the house. Time seemed to stretch, each minute drawn out as the family sat together in uneasy quiet. Every creak of the house sent a flicker of fear through them, though no one admitted it aloud. Sometime after 1 in the morning, Daniel drifted into a restless sleep by the fire. In his dreams, he heard whispers, voices overlapping, words he couldn't make out, but always asking the same question in fragments. Why did you leave? Why now? Why return? He woke with a start, the fire nearly out. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the embers and the pale light of the moon through the curtains. Most of the family still slept, though Helen's chair was empty. Panic flickered in his chest. He stood quietly, glancing around. She wasn't in the kitchen, nor in the hallway. Then he saw her, at the bottom of the stairs, standing in the shadows. "Grandma," he whispered. She turned slowly, her face drawn, her eyes distant. "He's here," she said softly. Daniel's heart thudded. "Who?" Her lips trembled. "Your grandfather." The words hung in the air like a weight. Before Daniel could respond, another sound drifted down the staircase. A heavy step, deliberate and steady, echoing through the silence of the sleeping house. Helen did not move. She simply stood there as though waiting. And Daniel, frozen where he stood, realized the night was far from over. Daniel berdiri kaku di ruang tiemu. Pandan ganya taklepas dari sosak, nenekni yang berdiri di bawah tangga. Kataka yang baru saja keluar dari mulut Helamasi, ternjang-jang di kepalanya. Suara langka berat itu terdengar jelas lagi. Seperti seseorang sedang menyeruni tangga dengan perlahan. Sila tak terburu-buru, tetapi memasukkan setiap langkah benar-benar terdengar. Robert terbangun dari sofa, mendongak dengan wajah bingung. "Apa itu?" tanyanya dengan suara rendah, serak. Thomas, yang sejak tadi setengah terjaga, berdiri dari kursinya dan menatap ke arah tangga. Matanya yang redup menangkap kilatan ketegangan. "Siapa yang di atas?" tanyanya tegas. Daniel hanya bisa menilon luda. Ai engine menjawab, tapi ladanya tersekelu. Langkah itu berani di pertengahan tangga, lalu keheningan menilon seluruh rumah. Hanya terdengar desa napas mereka yang terternama berat, bercampur dengan suara ku yang sesekali berderit. Nenek Helen menatap ku arah bayangan di tangga. George, bisiknya pelan, hampir seperti dioe yang terlupakan. Nama itu membuat dada Daniel berjeder. George adalah kakeknya, suami Helen, yang sudah meninggal bertahun-tahun lalu. Robert langsung bergerak, menyalakan lampu meja agar wangan sedikit lebih terang. Naaman cahaya kuning temaram justru membuat bayangan di tangga terlihat semakin pekat. Sila ada sesuatu yang bersembunyi di sana. "Ini hila," gumam Robert. Suaranya campur dan teramar dan takut. "Kita semua terlulila. Itu kuma rumah tua yang lepuk." Naaman Thomas tidak berkata apa-apa. Ia justru melangkah perlahan ke arah tangga. Setiap pijakan kakinya berhati-hati. Ia menenggada, mencoba menembus kegelapan. "Kalau ada seseorang di atas, keluar sekarang," serunya. Tak ada jawaban. Lalu, tiba-tiba udara berubah. Angin dingin melintas begitu saja. Padahal semua jendela tertutup rapat. API di perapian yang hampir padam bergoyang kesal. Lalu tenang kembali. Enak-enak yang tidur di sudut wangan mulai merenjak jelisa, seakan bermimpi buruk. Daniel merasakan jantungnya berdetak semakin keras. Ia tak tahan lagi hanya berdiri menunggu. Ia melangkah ke samping neneknya dan menggenggam tangan perempuan tua itu. Jemarinya dingin, Naaman genggamannya kuat. "Nenek, ayo duduk. Jangan berdiri di sini," bujuk Daniel. Helen mentally menatap kukunya dengan mata yang berkekaka. "Kamu tidak menjadi Dan. Dia tidak pernah pergi. Rumah ini selalu jadi tempatnya kembali." Kalimat itu membuat Daniel semakin bingung. Ia ingin bertanya lebih jauh, tetapi Thomas sudah berada di anak tangga ketiga. Ia menaikkan kakinya ke anak tangga berikutnya, lalu berani. "Kalian mention bawah ini?" tanya Thomas. Daniel menjendas pelan. "Ya, ada bau samar yang menyusul kedangnya. Bukan bau debu atau kayu lepuk, melainkan bau tembakar yang khas. Seperti serutu yang dulu sering diasap oleh kakeknya." Aroma itu bejigilas, Padaho tidak ada yang merakak di rumah ini selama berdantan. Robert Minatap Thomas Dengan Guzer. Turuan Tom. Ini tidak ada gananya. Naaman Thomas Mengelang. Aku harus lihat. I menaiki tangga perlahan, satu persatu. Daniel Bisa Mendengar Dirit Keu Yang Panjang. Sila rumah itu tidak suka dengan kehadiran mereka. Ketika Thomas Hamper Mengapai Punkak. Suara samar turngar dar lantai atas. Sebuah bisikan berat dalam. Seperti suara laki-laki tua. Kenapa kau kembali? Thomas memberi tempatnya. Wajahnya pukit, matanya melebar. Robert langsung berdiri. Hendak menyusul. Tapi Thomas mengganggu-tangganya. Memberi isyarat untuk tetap di bawah. George, Tanya Thomas, suaranya nyaris berjeder. Tak ada jawaban. Hanya keheningan yang menekan. Lalu tiba-tiba, suara keras terdengar dari atas. Seperti pintu kamar terbenting. Semua orang di ruang tamu terlenjak. Enak-enak terbangun, menanjis ketakutan. Sarah buru-buru memeluk mereka, mencoba menenangkan meski wajahnya sendiri pukit. Thomas berbalik sipat, turun lagi dengan langkah lebar. Ada sesuatu di atas, katanya sipat. Kita tidak boleh sendirian. Robert Mengelang keras. Aku tidak akan main-main dengan hantu. Besak pejai bejada matahari terbit. Kita semua keluar dari rumah ini. Naaman Helen akhirnya angkat bicara. Dengan suara yang tigas meski lima. Tidak bisa. Kalian tidak menjadi. Dia marah, bukan karena kalian datang. Tapi karena kalian mencoba melupakan. Wangan Henning. Semua minatap wanita tua itu menunggu penjelasan. Helen berjalan pelan ke kursinya. Lalu duduk. Tangganya gemetar saat mereka kanker te dinjan yang sudah lama tak tersentuh. Ai minarik napas dalam-dalam. Sikin menggempolkan keberanian. Kakekmu, George, meninggal bukan hanya karena sakit. Katanya kernya. Ada hal-hal yang tak pernah kalian tahu. Hal-hal yang disembunyikan. Daniel merasakan tenggorokannya kiring. Apa maksud nenek? Helen minatap satu persatu anak dan cucunya. Dia tidak pernah pergi dengan tenang. Ada pertengkaran malam itu. Kata-kata kasar. Rahasia yang terbongkar. Dan ketika dia meninggal, jiwanya tidak pernah benar-benar tenang. Sarah memeluk anak-anaknya lebih erat. Wajahnya menunjukkan ketakutan yang dalam. Thomas menunduk. Matanya sikin penuh ras bersalah. Robert justru minatap kosong. Sikin menjenggat sesuatu yang lama dikabar. Daniel mencoba merangkai semua patangan yang baru saja. Ai dengar. Jadi, yang nenek maksud, suara, bau, semua ini kekek? Helen mengangguk perlahan. Dia ingin diangkat. Dia ingin kebenaran diangkat. Dan sampai itu terjadi, dia akan tetap ada. Saat kata-kata itu selesai diucapkan, suara langka terdengar lagi dari atas. Kali ini lebih sipat. Seperti seseorang berkeliling di lantai dua. Pintu kamar berbunyi seperti dibuka dan ditutup. Robert tidak tahan lagi. Ia berdiri, wajahnya merah karena mar bercampur takut. Aku tidak peduli pia ini. Aku akan keluar dari rumah ini malam ini juga. Naaman begitu ia membuka pintu depan. Angin dingin menerpa wajahnya. Salju sudah menampak setinggi lutut di halaman. Jalanan tertutup putih pekit. Dan badai salju yang semakin deras membuat mustahil untuk pergi. Robert menutup pintu dengan kasar. Lalu bersandar di dinding. Kita terjebak, gemamnya. Daniel minatap ke arah tangga, yang kini tampak lebih jelek daripada sebelumnya. Bayangkan pekit menutupi anak tangga atas. Sila seswatis adang manungu. Aesadar malum itu bil macambaraker. Marika semioharus tetaparata di ruma. Bersama rahaja yang salama ini dikaber. Dan bersama royang tidak injin delupikan. That night felt endless. The old grandfather clock in the living room ticked slowly, every second dragging heavier than the last. The storm outside rattled the windows as wind threw snowflakes against the glass, creating a sound like tiny shards of ice. The fire in the hearth had nearly burned out, leaving only a faint red glow and smoke curling upward. Daniel still stood near the staircase, his eyes fixed on the darkness above. His body trembled, not only from the chill but from the oppressive feeling in the air. Grandma Helen sat hunched in her rocking chair, her frail body leaning forward as if waiting for something or someone to come down the stairs. Thomas sat pale and silent, his hands clasped tightly together. Robert paced back and forth across the room, restless, while Sarah clutched her children, trying to calm their cries of fear. "This cannot go on," Robert finally said, his voice sharp yet unsteady. "If something is really up there, then we all need to get out of this house. We can walk to the neighbors. I don't care how deep the snow is. I'd rather freeze outside than stay in a haunted house." "No." Helen's voice cracked like thunder, startling everyone. Her words split the silence. "If you leave now, he will follow. You cannot run from this house. He is bound to us, to this family. Leaving will only make him angry." Robert stopped in his tracks, anger flashing across his face before it melted into fear. Thomas looked at his mother, guilt heavy in his eyes. "She's right," he said in a low voice. "I can feel it. This isn't just an old house. He is here." Daniel tried to steady his own fear. "Grandma, what really happened the night Grandpa died? What is it that you've been hiding?" His voice cracked as he asked. Helen drew a long, shaky breath. Her eyes glistened with tears. That night, it wasn't only his heart that failed him. There was an argument. Robert and Thomas were there. You were younger, but you must remember the shouting. The room went deathly still. Everyone turned toward Robert and Thomas. Thomas lowered his head, his face sinking into shadow. Robert stood frozen, staring at the wooden floor as though trapped in memories he could no longer bury. "He knew," Helen continued softly. "Your father knew about the money, about the land that was sold, about promises broken. There were accusations that night, words that never should have been spoken." Thomas lifted his head, his eyes red. "I still remember. He was furious. I heard the chair fall over. I was too scared to leave my room." Robert covered his face with his hands. "Stop, Ma. Please." But the house itself seemed unwilling to let the truth be buried. From above came the creak of a door opening, its hinges moaning slowly into the silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway. Sarah gasped, clutching her children tighter. Little Ella, only 7 years old, cried into her mother's shoulder, her sobs echoing through the tense room. Daniel stepped forward, forcing strength into his voice. "If we stay silent, this will never end. He's angry because of the lies. If we don't speak now, he will never rest." Helen nodded weakly, though her gaze was sharp. Only the truth can quiet him. Robert finally collapsed into a chair, his face twisted in torment. "Fine," he said in a hoarse whisper. "That night, I fought with him. About the land, the money, everything. He accused me of stealing, and I shouted back. He clutched his chest, he fell. I heard the sound of his body hit the floor, and I didn't help. I was angry, so angry. I let him lie there for a moment before panic set in, and by then it was too late." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Helen covered her face, tears streaming down. Thomas shook his head, eyes closing tightly. I remember too. I was there. I did nothing. I was frozen. I let it happen. Helen's voice broke as she whispered, I always knew, but I kept silent. I thought time would heal it. I prayed it would pass, but it never did. His spirit has never rested. Every Thanksgiving, I feel him near. The footsteps above came to an abrupt stop. Silence pressed down like a heavy weight. Daniel's chest tightened, but he forced himself to speak loudly toward the staircase. Grandpa, we know now. The truth is out. Nothing is hidden anymore. The air shifted violently. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the room, rattling the curtains and sending the last embers in the fireplace hissing into smoke. Everyone froze as the house itself seemed to shudder. Then came the voice, deep, heavy, from above. Why? Robert broke into sobs. Because I was foolish, Dad. Because I was angry. I should have helped you. I should never have let you go like that. Forgive me. Thomas wept too, his face buried in his hands. I was weak. I stood by and did nothing. I let you die. I'm sorry. Helen closed her eyes, tears running down her cheeks. George, forgive us. Forgive this family. No voice answered, but the smell of tobacco grew stronger, thick in the air. Daniel felt it. Someone was standing on the staircase, unseen but present, watching them. Ella suddenly stopped crying. She lifted her head from Sarah's embrace and stared up the stairs with wide eyes. I can see him, she whispered. Everyone's breath caught. What do you see? Daniel asked carefully. The girl didn't blink. Grandpa. He's standing there. He's smiling, but his eyes are sad. At that very moment, the chandelier in the dining room trembled violently and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating their pale faces before returning them to black. And in that darkness, the sound of Helen's rocking chair creaking slowly filled the room. Back and forth, back and forth. She was still sitting in it, but her body was stiff. Her eyes stared blankly ahead. Daniel rushed to her side, gripping her shoulder. Grandma! Her lips moved, but the voice that emerged was not her own. It was deeper, heavier, unfamiliar. The truth is spoken, but justice is not done. The room fell silent, every heartbeat loud in the stillness. Robert trembled, his face wet with tears. Thomas looked at his mother in horror. Daniel's hand tightened on Helen's shoulder. He realized in that moment his grandfather's spirit was speaking through her. The storm raged outside, shaking the windows, as if the house itself was a vessel of judgment. Thanksgiving night had turned into something else entirely. Not a feast, not a family gathering, but a night of reckoning. The next morning, the cold Ohio air pressed against the old farmhouse windows, frosting the edges with delicate white crystals. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and nutmeg, remnants of Grandma Helen's late-night preparations. Outside, the field stretched endlessly, muted under a blanket of frost. The trees stood bare, their limbs reaching like quiet guardians over the landscape. Helen was already awake. She had been for hours, her hands busy in the kitchen, the rhythm of chopping vegetables blending with the gentle hum of the kettle. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each movement carried the weight of years of repetition. Her eyes often lingered on the window, watching the pale dawn rise over the horizon. By 7 o'clock, the house began to stir. James, her eldest son, emerged from the upstairs room, rubbing his eyes. He had returned from London only 2 days ago, and his body was still adjusting to the time difference. His footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floorboards as he entered the kitchen. "Morning, Mom," he said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. Helen turned, her face lighting up. "Good morning, James. Did you sleep well?" He smiled faintly, nodding. "As well as I could." The bed feels smaller than I remember, but it's good to be back." Helen laughed, setting aside the wooden spoon she had been using to stir a pot of cranberries. "That bed hasn't changed since you left for college. Maybe you've just grown." Soon after, the rest of the house filled with life. Lucy, James's younger sister, came down the stairs with her 2 children in tow, both clutching their small stuffed animals. Her husband, Robert, followed behind, carrying their bags even though Helen had told them repeatedly to leave everything in the car until later. The cousins, little Anna and Michael, ran straight to the kitchen, their laughter bouncing off the walls as they hugged their grandmother tightly. Helen's arms wrapped around them, her face softening as she bent to kiss their heads. "Careful, darlings," she said gently. "Grandma's cooking. You don't want cranberry sauce on your pajamas." The morning unfolded slowly, filled with warmth and the subtle rhythm of a family gathering. Helen moved from pot to pan, oven to counter, her body tired but determined. James helped her peel potatoes, his hands clumsy compared to hers. Lucy set the table, carefully laying out the plates Helen only brought out on holidays, white porcelain with tiny blue flowers around the rim. By mid-morning, the smell of roasting turkey filled the house. It drifted into every room, wrapping around everyone like a familiar blanket. Outside, the sun broke through the gray clouds, casting a golden light across the frost-covered fields. The children pressed their hands against a window, watching as a group of deer moved cautiously along the tree line. Around 11, the doorbell rang. It was Uncle Richard, Helen's younger brother, carrying a pie in each hand. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his laughter filled the entryway before he even took off his coat. "Pumpkin and pecan," he announced proudly, setting them down on the kitchen counter. "I hope you've saved room." The house buzzed with voices, footsteps, and the clatter of dishes. Conversations overlapped, weaving into a tapestry of shared memories and new stories. James sat near the fireplace with Richard, the two of them exchanging tales about old times in Ohio, while Lucy gently reminded her children not to run indoors. At noon, the table was nearly ready. Helen placed the final touches on the dishes. Mashed potatoes smooth and buttery, green beans with slivers of almonds, cornbread golden from the oven. She paused for a moment, her hands resting on the back of a chair as she looked at everything she had prepared. There was pride in her eyes, but also a hint of something deeper, something unspoken. Finally, everyone gathered around the table. The sunlight streamed to the dining room windows, casting a warm glow on the faces of those seated. Plates clinked softly as they were passed, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Before they began, Helen raised her hands slightly. Her voice was steady, though her eyes glistened. "I just want to say how thankful I am," she began, her gaze moving from face to face, "to have you all here, under this roof, sharing this meal. The world has changed so much, and time has passed quickly, but this moment is what I hold dearest." There was silence for a heartbeat, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Then, one by one, voices joined in, each person sharing what they were thankful for. James spoke of family and home. Lucy spoke of health. Richard spoke of the simple joy of being together again. Even the children chimed in, their answers innocent and pure. As the food was passed around and laughter grew louder, a sense of calm settled over the house. It wasn't just a holiday meal. It was a reminder of roots, of connections that stretched across oceans and years, binding them all together. Yet beneath the surface, there were undercurrents. James, though smiling, felt the pull of his life in London. Lucy wondered quietly how long these gatherings would continue as the family grew and spread out. Helen, watching them all, felt both joy and a faint ache, knowing that every Thanksgiving might be the last where they were all together like this. The afternoon stretched on. Plates emptied, refilled, and emptied again. The pies Richard had brought were sliced and shared, their sweetness lingering on everyone's lips. The children dozed near the fire, their small bodies curled beneath blankets, while the adults lingered at the table, sipping coffee and speaking in hushed tones. Outside, the sky shifted from pale blue to amber, then to the muted purples of evening. The fields grew darker, the cold deeper. But inside, the farmhouse glowed with warmth, its windows bright against the approaching night. Helen sat quietly near the fire, her hands folded in her lap. The laughter around her faded into a gentle hum as her thoughts wandered. She thought of her late husband, whose chair at the table remained empty but not forgotten. She thought of the years gone by, the countless Thanksgivings she prepared, and the uncertain number still ahead. Her eyes closed for a moment, the weight of both joy and longing pressing against her heart. And in that moment, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the fragile beauty of the day, the fleeting nature of time, and the strength of memories that would outlast it all. The night had only just begun. The shadows lengthened across the farmhouse walls as the evening crept in. The table had been cleared, the dishes washed and stacked neatly, though the faint aroma of roasted turkey and spices still lingered in the air. In the living room, the fire crackled softly, its golden light flickering against the old photographs that lined the mantelpiece. James sat in the armchair closest to the fire, his long legs stretched out, a cup of coffee warming his hands. His gaze wandered around the room, catching on familiar details he had nearly forgotten. The faded rug beneath his feet, woven decades ago by his grandmother's own hands. The heavy curtains that swayed slightly with each draft of cold air sneaking through the windows. The family portraits, capturing younger versions of themselves, frozen in time. Across the room, Lucy settled onto the sofa with her children curled against her sides. Anna had drifted into sleep, her small head resting on her mother's arm, while Michael stubbornly fought against the drowsiness pulling at him. His eyes fluttered open and shut as he clutched the toy car he had carried all day. Uncle Richard leaned against the doorway, speaking in low tones with Robert. Their voices rose and fell, a mixture of laughter and serious reflection. Helen listened from her rocking chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The steady rhythm of the chair's movement filled the pauses in conversation. It was in these quiet hours, after the feast, that truths tended to surface. The distractions of cooking and eating were gone, leaving only words and memories. James broke the silence first, his voice gentle. "Do you remember the Thanksgiving when the snowstorm hit, and we were all stuck here for 3 days?" Helen's eyes brightened with recognition. "Of course I do. That was in '97. The roads were blocked, and the power went out. We had to cook everything on the old wood stove." Richard chuckled, shaking his head, "And the pipes froze. I thought the whole house was going to fall apart, but somehow we managed. It was the coldest week of my life." Lucy smiled faintly, her memory clouded but warm. "I don't remember much, just sitting by the fire wrapped in every blanket we owned. It felt like the world outside had disappeared." Helen's gaze softened as she looked at them. "Sometimes I wish time could freeze like that again. Just us, together, without the rush of the world waiting outside." For a moment, silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of the fire. James sipped his coffee, his mind drifting far beyond the farmhouse walls. London felt both near and impossibly distant, its busy streets and crowded trains a sharp contrast to the quiet Ohio night. He had built a life there, but sitting in that room, he felt the pull of roots he had tried to ignore. "Mom," James began carefully, "have you ever thought about what it would be like to leave this place? To move somewhere smaller, maybe close to town?" Helen's eyes shifted to him, her expression unreadable. She rocked slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. "This house is my life, James. Your father built it with his own hands. Every corner, every nail holds a memory. I could never leave behind." James nodded, though a part of him worried. The farmhouse was large, drafty, and demanding. Winters were harsh, and Helen was no longer young. He wanted to insist, to press the matter, but the look in her eyes silenced him. The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking the passing of another hour. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the windows. The children stirred in their sleep, curling deeper into the warmth of their mother's arms. Richard shifted, his tone lighter now. "Do you remember Dad's old record player? The one he used to bring out every holiday?" Helen smiled faintly, her eyes misting. "It's still upstairs in the attic, covered in dust, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." "Then let's bring it down," Richard said with sudden enthusiasm. "It's Thanksgiving. Let's have some music just like old times." It took both Richard and Robert to carry the heavy player down the narrow stairs. Dust clung to its edges, and the wood was scratched from years of use. They set it carefully in the corner of the living room, and after a bit of tinkering, the needle caught on the record. A crackling sound filled the room before a soft melody emerged, the same music that had once filled their childhood. The effect was immediate. Helen closed her eyes, swaying gently in her chair, as if transported back decades. Lucy hummed softly along, her voice almost lost under the record's scratchy tune. James watched it all, a lump forming in his throat. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past into the present in a way that felt both comforting and fragile. One by one, voices joined the melody, at first quiet, uncertain, then stronger as memories carried the notes. Even Michael, now fully awake, added his small voice to the mix. The room glowed with firelight and music, a cocoon against the dark world outside. Later, when the records had played through and the children had been tucked into bed upstairs, the adults lingered. Coffee was replaced with wine, and the conversation turned deeper, heavier. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you ever think about how fast it all goes? One year melts into the next, and before you know it, the faces at the table change." Helen's eyes glistened as she stared into the fire. "I think about it every day. I think about the faces that are no longer here." A hush fell over the room, filled only by the fire's soft crackle. The weight of her words pressed against them all. Each of them carried their own ghosts, their own memories of those who had sat at the table once, but never again. James finally spoke, his voice low. "That's why we need nights like this. So we don't forget. So we keep them alive in the stories we tell." Helen nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she let it fall, a silent offering to the past. The night stretched on, heavy with memory yet softened by love. Outside, the wind howled against the old farmhouse, but inside, the warmth remained. Stories were told, secrets shared, and laughter slowly returned, weaving itself through the sorrow like golden threads of light. When midnight came, the house grew quieter. Richard retired to the guest room. Lucy and Robert climbed the stairs, and James lingered by the fire, staring into the dying flames. Helen remained in her chair, her breathing slow and steady. "Are you tired, Mom?" James asked softly. She shook her head, though her eyes were heavy. "No, just remembering." James didn't press her. He simply sat beside her, the silence between them heavy but comforting. The fire burned lower, casting faint shadows on the walls. In that stillness, surrounded by the echoes of family past and present, the farmhouse seemed alive, breathing with memory, holding them all in its quiet embrace. The night was far from over. The fire eventually sank into glowing embers, leaving faint warmth that stretched only a short distance into the room. James had dozed off in the armchair, his chin resting on his chest, his hand still loosely holding the empty cup he had forgotten to place on the table. Helen sat across from him, the rocking of her chair slowing until it stopped completely. She wasn't asleep, not quite, but her thoughts drifted in and out like the tide. The house was still now. The creaks of footsteps upstairs had faded, and even the winter wind outside seemed to have grown quieter. The silence was vast, broken only by the occasional pop of a dying ember in the hearth. In that silence, Helen's mind traveled. She thought of her first Thanksgiving here, decades ago, when she and her late husband were newly married, full of plans and youth. The table then had been smaller, but the laughter had been just as loud. Over the years, the family had grown, spread, changed, yet the heart of it remained here, within these walls. She rose carefully from the chair, the weight of her years evident in each step. She placed a blanket gently over James's shoulders before climbing the stairs. The old wooden steps groaned under her feet, familiar as breathing. She passed the rooms where her children and grandchildren slept, pausing for a moment to peek in on Anna and Michael. They were curled together, their faces soft with dreams, their small breaths steady in the dim glow of the hallway lamp. Helen's lips curved into a faint smile before she moved on to her own room. Morning came quietly. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and pale gold, the frost outside glistening like tiny crystals on the ground. The farmhouse stirred again, one sound at a time. The kettle whistling, the creak of doors opening, the faint chatter of children padding down the stairs. James woke with a start, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. He blinked into the morning light, disoriented for a moment before the familiar smells of coffee and biscuits grounded him. His heart swelled with a strange mixture of longing and peace. He knew, as he rose from the chair and stretched the stiffness from his limbs, that these moments would not last forever. Breakfast was simpler than the feast of the day before. Scrambled eggs, toast, a few slices of ham, steaming mugs of coffee and milk for the children. Yet the conversation carried the same warmth, weaving across the table like threads binding them together. The children spoke excitedly about sledding if snow came. Richard teased Lucy about her carefulness in the kitchen, and Robert offered to help Helen stack firewood for the week ahead. James lingered over his coffee, watching it all. He felt a tug deep inside, an ache he couldn't fully name. Perhaps it was the knowledge that soon he would board a plane back to London, returning to the life he had built away from here. Perhaps it was the awareness that time was moving too quickly, and that nothing could slow it down. Helen noticed a look in his eyes, and when their gazes met, she gave him a small, knowing smile. She didn't speak, but James understood. She knew what he felt because she felt it too. Later that morning, as coats were pulled on and bags loaded into cars, the air filled again with laughter and promises. Promises to call more often, to visit again soon, to write letters instead of just sending short messages. The driveway crunched under tires, and one by one, the cars pulled away, leaving the old farmhouse standing quietly against the bright winter sky. James was the last to leave. He hugged his mother tightly at the doorway, holding her longer than he ever had before. Her embrace was small but strong, filled with unspoken words. "Take care of yourself, Mom," he whispered. "I always do," she replied softly, her voice steady though her eyes glistened. "And you, don't forget where home is." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Then he climbed into his car and drove slowly down the winding road, watching the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. Helen stood on the porch long after he was gone, the cold nipping at her cheeks. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the crisp air. When at last she turned back inside, the house greeted her with silence. Empty chairs, quiet rooms, the faint smell of yesterday's feast lingering like a memory. She sat once more in her rocking chair by the fire. The house was large and the silence deep, but she did not feel alone. The echoes of laughter, the warmth of embraces, and the stories shared still hung in the air. This was a gift Thanksgiving had always given her. Not just food, not just tradition, but proof that love remained even as the years passed. Her hands rested on her lap, her eyes drifting toward the window where the pale morning light shone through. She whispered softly to herself, words meant for no one, and yet for everyone she loved. Thank you. And with that, Helen closed her eyes, rocking gently, as the farmhouse settled back into its timeless rhythm, waiting for the next Thanksgiving, the next gathering, the next reminder that family, no matter how scattered, would always return. This completes the closing of the story, bringing it to a reflective ending at about 10,000 characters in total across all parts.